Hey everyone, Aiden here, and thanks for checking out the Fenrir Miniatures channel. You may have noticed on my Instagram that I've been painting some Cadian infantry for a commission. They're part of a larger army for one of my clients, and the colour scheme started from the client's request for a Mars, or sort of desert style scheme. And I remembered that one of the old Imperial Guard codexes that I still have, I think it was a 5th edition one, had this double page spread with all of these cool colour schemes in it, and I was quite lucky to find this one, the 39th Cadian Velt Fatigues. The client was happy with this one, and that was applied to the Ogrins and Stormlord tank that you're seeing now. And it was quite a fun exercise integrating this into the newer models from the Cadian Stands box. So without further ado, let's see how I went about painting this scheme. I started off by base coating the entire model with Steel Legion drab, as this was the base for the cloth on the fatigues. And I used an airbrush, but you could definitely just apply this by hand. I decided to start with the fatigues, as for the first step we're going to be slapping on a shade made by mixing CADIANS flesh and contrast medium in equal parts. I really enjoy creating my own shade mixes by mixing regular paints with contrast medium, as I find it flows really nicely and it dries with a nice smooth finish. It's also a good way to tune your shade to a specific colour if that colour isn't readily available in the contrast or shade range. At this point I wanted to build contrast a bit more, so I lined in Rhinox hide around all the recesses of the cloth. It sort of helps to break everything up and helps to make the model not look so flat. I decided to clean things up a bit by reintroducing Steel Legion drab and doing a bit of layering to sharpen things up a bit. I'd say this stage is fairly optional really. You could definitely jump straight into highlighting, but I wanted to get things looking a bit cleaner. If you are going to do this however, remember to leave out the deepest recesses, as we don't want to cover over the shading that we've created. Chunky highlights of Xandri dust were used to start off the highlighting stages. Work your way around and pick out the edges to start to create some definition. If you need any help with definitions of some of the terms that I've used so far in this video, please check the video above for a bit of an explanation. This was refined by picking out some prominent areas within a Shabti bone edge highlight. And with that, the main part of the cloth is done. Now it's time to start creating the camo pattern on the fatigues. Wordbearer's red and Rhinox hide were mixed 2:1 and used to create the organic squiggly shapes of the pattern. I find it's best to use a fine short brush for this. Screaming Skull was then used to create the dots of the pattern, which only occurred to me recently looks suspiciously similar to the symbol of one of the dark gods. And Anyway, it's probably fine. There's probably no need to worry about that. Moving on to the armor, a base coat of Wordbearer's Red was applied. Recess shading was applied with a 2-to-1 mix of Rhinox Hide and AK Intense Black. This does look quite dark on the palette, but it does create some nice separation between parts on the model. For the highlighting, we're kicking off with a chunky highlight of Wordbearer's Red and Squig Orange mixed 50-50. Pure Squig Orange is then applied as our edge highlight to help sharpen things up a bit. As I wasn't quite happy with the definition on the edges of the armor at this stage, I applied Xandri Dust sparingly to sharpen things up a bit more. Moving on now to the skin and hair. I went for a dark skin tone for this model, and I began by base coating with Catachan Flesh. Some shading was then done by mixing Cygor Brown with Contrast Medium in a 3-to-1 ratio, and applied all over the skin as if you would with a shade paint. Cyanide brown is a really nice deep tone, but it also has a nice rich, almost sort of chestnut-like warmth to it, so it's really nice to use for dark skin tones. Much like we did with the cloth, I'm reintroducing the base coat, in this case Catachan Flesh of course, and I'm doing some layering to bring the raised areas back to this tone and starting off the highlighting process. Just remember to leave this out of the deepest creases and areas of shadow. Next, we're using Night Quest or Flesh to pick out some of the raised areas. I focus this around the tops of the cheeks, the nose, lips, and the tops of any other creases on the face. For the hands, this will be used to start to define the fingers. Finally, CADIAN Flesh Tone was used to push the highlighting further, being applied to the same areas but covering a smaller area and focusing on the higher points where applicable. On the hands, it's mostly used on the knuckles to help those kind of stand out a bit. The hair was very quick and easy as there's not much to it on this model. I simply base coated it with AK Intense Black, and then picked out some highlights with Dawnstone. These guys have got quite a lot of straps, pouches and belts on them, and I decided to paint them in a dark brown leather look to sort of contrast nicely with the armour and the cloth. They were base coated with a 2-to-1 mix of Rhinox hide and AK Intense Black. This was then shaded with Nuln Oil. A chunky highlight of Dryad bark was carefully applied to the edges. And finally, Baneblade Brown was used to pick out the very edges of the leather. I would recommend utilising the side of your brush to get the cleanest edge highlights at this stage. I wanted to break up the leathers by applying a different shade of brown to the gaiters and selected satchels on the models. We're starting off by applying a base coat of Catachan Flesh, and yeah, you might be thinking by now that I've used a lot of the same paints repeatedly throughout these recipes, and truth be told, this was not intentional, but I think it's cool to see how much you can get out of only a few paints when you apply different shades and highlighting to change their hue or tone. The shade that we applied this time around was Agrux Earthshade. For the highlighting, we're pushing things into a warmer territory and starting a chunky highlight with Mournfang Brown. And this was reinforced by applying some fine edge highlights of Talon Sand. Our next task is to tackle the black areas, and we're starting off with a base coat of AK Intense Black. We're applying this to the boots and to the weapon casing. For the chunky highlight stage on both of these items, we're applying Vallejo Model Color Black Grey, which is a nice neutral grey to start the highlighting from. I wanted the boots to have a warmer appearance by using Storm Vermin fur. I always think of leather being a more organic material, so I feel that pushing the highlighting into a warmer zone just feels more natural. And conversely to that, I wanted to push a cooler look on the weapon casing, so I went with Mechanica Standard Grey for the edge highlights. Dawnstone was then used to pick out some of the sharper edges and corners. I took this opportunity now to apply the sand to the base, and it was pretty basic.
Pun intended.
Cover it with some PVA glue, throw a bit of sand on it, and once that's dry, coat it with a layer of heavily thinned PVA to seal it all in. I typically try to keep things pretty simple with the metals on my tabletop models. Thankfully, the Vallejo metallics make it very easy to achieve a great look. I've been using Vallejo Metal Color Dark Aluminium almost exclusively lately for base coating my metals, as it's a great alternative to lead belcher. I've decanted some of it into an old GW pot. I found that it reacts strangely when I've used it off of a wet palette. It kind of splits a bit, so I've kind of avoided using it on a wet palette. Use it on a traditional palette or straight out of the pot like I've been using it. And I typically don't look forward to painting metals if I'm being honest, as it can be a bit fiddly and time consuming, but this paint has sort of revolutionized that for me. It's really a no-brainer now. It's just so simple, and it gets a really nice clean finish in one coat. I like to shade my metallics with a 50-50 of Nuln Oil and Nuln Oil Gloss. I know that the gloss version isn't available anymore, so you could just add a touch of gloss varnish into your Nuln Oil. It's really just there to help the wash flow into the recesses better, and it helps to keep a bit of the luster in the finish of the metallic, gives it a bit more of a satin finish. Really, you could just go with straight regular Nuln Oil too. And another amazing metallic paint from Vallejo, also an airbrush paint, but works really well straight out of the bottle with a regular brush, Vallejo Model Air Aluminium. I'm just picking out the edges with this and sharpening the details a bit. We're moving into some of the details now, and I couldn't ignore the cigar, but I treated this very simply. Just a dot of AK Intense White on the end, followed by a bit of Magmadroth Flame over that, just to make it look lit. The ranking symbol on his shoulder pad was base coated with Ulthuan Grey, though I'd probably suggest Celestra Grey here for this actually, as Ulthuan is pretty close to white and doesn't really contrast a whole lot with the highlighting. I then just picked out the edges with AK Intense White. Moving on to the base. The basing is done in a sort of Mars style, being a rich red earth, and this is a mix that I came up with a while ago. It starts with a base coat of 3 parts Doombull Brown to 1 part of Corn Red, which coincidentally is pretty similar to Wordbearer's Red. But I wanted to keep some continuity as this is the basing scheme for a few of my clients' other models. Over that, a dry brush of Scrag Brown to start picking out the sand. Followed by a Tau Light Ochre. And finally, Ungor Flesh. I typically try to reduce the amount of pressure on the brush and the area covered on the base with each successive color, just to sort of help it blend a little bit. Otherwise it can tend to look a bit flat if it's just all covered with the final color that you've dry brushed on. And last of all, for the painting side of things, just give the rim a coat of AK Intense Black, or whatever color you wish to go with. You could use pre-made tufts for the basing. I've just gone with the old school PVA and static brass approach for this. And with that, we are done. I hope you found this video useful. Please let me know in the comments below if you've got any other suggestions for videos that you'd like to see in the future, and I'll try and bring them to you. But for now, I will see you next time. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.